Cooley Law School is delighted to sponsor tonight's event and to support the Great Decisions Foreign Policy Lecture Series. And of course, Cooley is excited to be a part of the Grand Rapids community. In addition to the JD courses we have in Grand Rapids, we also have a Master of Laws degree, or two, in two important subject areas, taxation and intellectual property. We now have 4 new LLMs pending ABA review, including one in U.S. legal studies for foreign lawyers. When Dixie offered us the opportunity to become involved with this particular program on the European Union at 50, Dean William Weiner, the Associate Dean for International Programs, and I jumped at the chance. Cooley offers 2 EU law courses available at its 3 campuses. Our Toronto summer sessions also offer European Union law courses taught by a British expert on the European Union. A number of our students take courses on the European Union when they head overseas for foreign study. In fact, Dean Weiner was actually in Strasbourg on May 1st, 2004 on a Fulbright visit when the European Union was expanded to add 10 new members. Tonight's program on the European Union is indeed a most appropriate lecture for Cooley to sponsor. Cooley Law School appreciates the opportunity to be a part of Grand Rapids' educational community, a supporter of the World Affairs Council, and the inviter or the introducer of visiting speakers of the caliber of Dr. John McCormick. They told me not to give you many details with regard to Dr. McCormick's impressive resume, but they're all included in a handout that you should all have. Dr. McCormick is an expert on the European Union, and I would like to note that he has 3 degrees which he earned on 3 different continents, and so he's also very well traveled. He will help us discern tonight if indeed the European Union has finally reached a superpower status. Dr. McCormick, thank you for being with us, and we look forward to your talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm hooked up with 2 microphones, so I hope they're both working and you can hear me in mono or stereo. I'm not quite sure which. Does everybody hear me okay at the back there? Okay, good. All right. Minutes. I've given a lot of talks on the European Union. I teach a course on the European Union every semester to students at Indiana University in Indianapolis, which is where I'm from. And if I was giving a lecture tonight on the United States, here or in Europe, I wouldn't have to explain what the United States was. Everybody knows what it is. It's a state. It has a history. It has a political system. It has a flag, and everybody knows what it is. The first problem with the European Union is trying to pin down exactly what it is. When people ask me what I study, I say the European Union. Okay, what's that? Okay, well, if you've got 15 minutes and I can explain what this thing is, this very strange entity. It's unique. A lot of people have had difficulty really understanding or coming to task with what it is about and what it signifies. Even political scientists are undecided on what to call it. All that I can say with some certainty is that the European Union is somewhere between a conventional international organization and a potential future United States of Europe. But where it is on that spectrum is very difficult to say. And a lot of Europeans are either very much in favor of the EU at some point becoming a United States of Europe, but a lot of Europeans are also very much opposed to that idea. So it's controversial apart from anything else. What I'd like to do then, in terms of background, is just to provide you with a very brief history of the EU, where it came from, what its purposes have been. Then very quickly look at its institutional structure. It doesn't formally have a government, but it has institutions which look much like a European government. And then talk about what the European Union does, what impact it's had on the lives of Europeans themselves. Talk about some of its achievements and talk about some of the problems that it's faced over the years. And then finish off with what may be the more sort of controversial part of my comments, and that is the argument that the European Union is a superpower, which is the title of my book is The European Superpower. I'm one of the very few people in the world who actually believes that it's a superpower, and so hopefully I can convert some of you to that this evening. First of all, a brief history, if I can get this going. The European Union has been around, well, for roughly 50 years. It dates back to the early 1950s to the Treaty of Paris, which was signed in 1951, The EU at 50 is dated from the Treaty of Rome, which came a few years later. After the war, a lot of Europeans who had said that after the Great War there should be attempts to develop peace in Europe said, okay, this time we really mean it. The Second World War was a kind of a European civil war in many ways, and so a lot of people looked at this question of how are we going to get Europeans to be at peace with each other. And after World War II, there was also the additional problem that not only were Europeans concerned about the threat they posed to themselves, but they now found themselves in the middle of this Cold War with the Americans on one side and the Soviets on the other. So peace was the major motivating factor behind the creation of what has become the European Union. Because the question was how to achieve peace. And you couldn't start off with anything too big or too ambitious. It had to be something small but meaningful. And so what happened with the Treaty of Paris was they set up this entity called the European Coal and Steel Community, which was an attempt to try and encourage the countries of Europe to bring together their coal and steel industries. And the argument here was that once they combined operation in this very narrow area, that there would be this sort of process of political spillover, and that Europeans would find themselves cooperating in a whole variety of additional areas. So the Treaty of Paris set up the ECSC. That's the other thing about the EU, by the way. It's absolutely replete with acronyms, which I will try and keep to the minimum this evening. The invitation was sent out to all European countries to join, and only 6 said yes. West Germany, France, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. Very quickly after the creation of the coal and steel community, it was decided that this was a useful first step, but another bigger and more substantial step should be taken. And so the Treaty of Rome was signed in 1957, which created a new entity called the European Economic Community. And the goal of the European Economic Community was to create a single market in Europe, to bring down the barriers to trade among European countries, and to establish a common external tariff so that all goods coming into the community would be subject to the same controls and tariffs. The same 6 countries signed up to the Treaty of Rome and became members of the European Economic Community. So this is a very modest start. The obvious thing that was missing once these 2 entities had been set up was additional membership. I mean, it was a good start to have these 6 countries, but it would also be good to bring other European countries in. And so over the course of the next 40 years or 50 years, there's this been gradual process of enlargement, which has been a major theme in the European Union, how to encourage other countries to join, how to integrate those countries, and then how to deal with the political and economic impact of expansion. And what you have here is the current state of play in the European Union. Britain, Ireland, and Denmark joined in 1973. Then Spain, Portugal, and Greece joined in the 1980s. Then Austria, Sweden, and Finland joined in 1995. And then most recently, there's been the biggest in terms of the number of countries, but the smallest in terms of economic size, expansion to Eastern Europe. So Poland, Hungary, the Baltic countries, and then most recently Romania and Bulgaria have joined. So we now have 27 member states, all of the countries up here except the sort of this pinky colored country, and then the 3 green ones, Norway, Iceland, and Switzerland, are not yet members. 3 countries have been accepted in principle for membership, and that's Croatia, Macedonia, and Turkey. Turkey is a real problem as far as the Europeans are concerned, and I noticed that it's one of the focuses of the piece in the article that you read. Negotiations have opened with Turkey. There is this question about whether Turkey is a European country. Well, a very small piece of it is, right there. The rest of it is not. It's Asia. Also, Turkey is a big country with a population of 73 million, I think it is. It's a poor country, and it's a Muslim country, and it has a not particularly good human rights record. So ingesting Turkey is going to be a challenge like no other challenge that the Europeans have had to face over the years. But I predict that Turkey will be allowed in at some point. It's just a question of when. It's going to be at least 10 years, possibly longer. And there's going to be a lot of bitterness and hard arguments on both sides. A friend of mine who's Turkish in Indianapolis, he's now so resentful that he says Turkey should just simply withdraw its application and go off and do something else, because they feel if this is the way you're going to treat Turkey, then you don't deserve to have us cooperate. So I've been trying to convince him to just have a little bit more patience, and at some point Turkey will join. But then I guess I'm optimistic. Over the last 50 years, the Europeans have expanded the reach of the European Union. It has gone into more and more policy areas. There is now almost no policy area in the EU that is not touched in some fashion by European policy and by European law. Now, the extent to which the EU impacts national policy varies from one policy area to another. One area in which they have not succeeded very well has been in the development of a common European foreign policy. They have made some moves in that direction. They've had common positions on specific problems, such as how to deal with Iran or Libya or Zimbabwe. But in terms of the big picture, the squabbles among Europeans have become much more famous over time than their agreements. In the 1990s, the differences over what to do about the Balkans was a great embarrassment for the Europeans. And of course, March 2003, probably the biggest foreign policy embarrassment the Europeans have dealt with so far, was the fight over what to do with Iraq, with Germany and France going in one direction and Britain and Spain and Italy and other countries going in the other direction. So in terms of common foreign policy, a mixed record. In terms of a common trade policy, extremely successful. And it's interesting how little attention is paid in the media and in political discussions about trade policy. If you look at the literature, the political science literature on the EU, there are shelves full of books about the common foreign policy, which is interesting because it's been a bit of a failure. There's almost nothing being published on European trade policy, which has been very successful. What the Europeans do now is, instead of the 27 countries negotiating separately with third parties, they negotiate among themselves, achieve a common trade position, and then they work together in their negotiations, say, for example, with the United States. And this has become enormously important because the EU is now the biggest trading power in the world. It accounts for about 40% of global exports and imports. And you can see that one of the consequences of this with the number of trade disputes that the European Union has had with the United States. The vast majority of transatlantic trade is peaceful, but there have been a number of substantial disputes between the two sides, which is emblematic, really, of the growing importance of the EU market and the growing confidence that Europeans have to take on even the United States on trade policy. Other areas in which the Europeans have expanded, well, the single market has probably been the most notable achievement of European integration. With some exceptions, it's now literally possible to move around these 27 countries almost unchallenged. There's free movement now of people and money and goods and services. The only exception has been with Eastern Europe because of concerns that the Western part of Europe had about a huge influx of workers from Eastern Europe after these countries joined, which has happened anyway, and it doesn't seem to have hurt anybody very much. And there's this mythical figure of the Polish plumber that you hear spoken about now in Britain. Whenever you get somebody to come and do some contracting work on your home in Britain, the chances are that it's going to be someone from Eastern Europe. I can't remember the last time I went out to a restaurant in Britain where the waiter or waitress wasn't from Poland. It's very interesting. And the British seem to have taken this in their stride. So now, if you're a legal resident of the EU, you can move to almost any of these countries. You can take all of your funds with you. You can take your pension with you if you want to retire to the south of Spain. You can take your job with you if that's possible, or you can find new work in the place that you're going. There are a few restrictions, but essentially the EU has become very close to being the kind of open labor market that the United States is, and the EU aspires to become like that. Educational qualifications can be transferred. The way they started out to do that was to look at each profession one at a time and to try and work out equivalency across all of the countries. And of course, this took ages. It took something like 17 years to agree transferability of medical qualifications. And then I suppose somebody decided, well, this is crazy. We're going to take forever to do this. Why don't we just say, if it's good enough for one country, it's good enough for all the rest? And so that's what they decided in a principle called mutual recognition. Of course, I'm paraphrasing years and years of bitter political debate, but that's the essential principle they've come up with. So if you qualify as a German dentist, then Spain will recognize your qualifications as being okay. You can transfer your university credits with you now. They have a thing called the European Credit Transfer System, ECTS. So if you get a degree or half a degree in one country, you can shift it and take it with you to another country. So mobility has increased quite dramatically. The most notable economic achievement, of course, has been the single currency, the euro. I find when I'm talking to American audiences that even though they might be a bit quizzical about the European Union, when I mention the euro, this is something that everybody can latch onto because it's something which is real and significant, and if you travel to most of Europe now, you have to change your currency into euros. And the euro has become very powerful relative to the US dollar's weakness, which has caused a lot of debate in this country. As of today, I think it was $1.54 to the euro. 8 years ago, it was 85 cents to the euro. So there's been a dramatic shift in the relative value of the dollar and the euro. Unfortunately, this has made things expensive, European exports expensive. It's also made Europe expensive as a place to go as a tourist. The weak dollar has been good for US exporters because it makes our products cheaper. But the euro is not just an economic achievement, it's also a political achievement. And to a large extent, the move to create a single currency was politically driven as well as being economically driven. 15 countries have adopted the euro, the notable exception at the moment being Britain. But the thing about Britain is they always get in eventually. They didn't join the European Economic Community at the beginning because they thought they were still a great power and they had this great relationship with the United States. And then along came the Suez Crisis in 1956, which was a big wake-up call for a lot of people in Britain. And fairly soon after the Suez Crisis, Britain started saying, well, maybe we should apply to join the European Economic Community. And they would have got in much more quickly had it not been for President Charles de Gaulle, who personally vetoed Britain's entry twice. But Britain got in 1973. I think Britain will have to adopt the euro at some point. It's just a question of when they do that. It just makes economic sense. It makes political sense. The benefits of staying out, I think, will begin to be replaced by the benefits of joining the euro. A lot of people in Britain don't want to join the euro simply because the pound is an important national symbol, a symbol of British independence. But the British are becoming to realize slowly that they are in fact a European country. Now, you may be surprised to hear me say that, but if you talk to British people and ask them, where they're going on vacation, well, I'm going to Europe. Well, how can you do that since you're already there? And they always talk about continental Europeans as being something different, a different species. And you all know about the special relationship that Britain has with the United States. British people know and care much more about the United States than they do about the French. But they're changing. More and more British people are going to the continent and attitudes are changing. Other areas in which the EU has been active, environmental policy. This is an area which hasn't been politically difficult because it makes a lot of sense for countries that share a very small landmass to come up with common foreign environmental policies. If they've got rivers flowing through 6 or 7 countries, in order to manage those rivers, they've all got to get together. You've got air blowing over multiple different countries. In order to make that air cleaner, you have to get countries working together. So the vast majority of environmental legislation in the EU now is made at the European level and not at the national level anymore. There's been an attempt to distribute investment to the poorer parts of the European Union to try and, the process is called Cohesion. It's another piece of European Union jargon, to try and make all of the EU economically and socially cohesive. And so money has been distributed from the richer parts of the EU to the poorer parts. Generally speaking, the richer parts are in this kind of area here, and the poorer parts are on the periphery, so southern Italy, Greece, Spain, Portugal, Ireland, and the more sparsely populated northern parts of Scandinavia. The great success story there has been Ireland, which when it joined in 1973 was one of the poorest countries in the European Economic Community. with decades of history of emigration out of Ireland. As a result of a combination of European Union investment in Ireland plus sensible economic policies in Ireland, everything has changed. Ireland is now one of the wealthiest countries in Europe. On a per capita basis, the Irish are now wealthier than the Germans, which is really quite a remarkable turnabout. And people don't leave Ireland anymore. They go back to Ireland, except now it's becoming so expensive they're not going back in quite so many numbers as they did, say, 10 years ago. But Dublin has become one of the wealthiest and the most expensive cities in Europe, when it used to be one of the poorest cities in Europe. Now, several East European countries are hoping to do the same thing. They're hoping that with sensible policies plus investment, that Ireland can be replicated over here. And that's quite conceivable. Eastern Europe is a very good investment opportunity. Real estate is still relatively cheap compared to the rest of Europe. If you're looking for a good investment opportunity, I recommend Eastern Europe. Look for a mutual fund that deals with small cap companies in Eastern Europe. They've developed a thing called the Trans-European Network System, TENS, T-E-Ns. These are transport networks and energy networks to try and bring the whole of the EU together, building highways and railroad systems, particularly a high-speed railroad network, which now connects most of the part of Western Europe, and they're going to extend this into Eastern Europe as well. A highway system that would connect European countries and allow poorer parts of the EU to benefit from influx of people and investment from the richer parts of the EU. So multiple different areas. Areas in which they haven't done very much has been, for example, in tax policy. There is no European tax, and member states have been very keen to make sure that there is no European tax. They want to keep tax policy at the national level and not have an independent budget for the European Union, because they feel that way they can keep the EU more under control. Criminal justice is still very much done at the local level. Most education is done at the local level. But overall now, there's been a shift of policy making towards the European level. As I said, there have been some institutions that have been created which are a little bit like a European government, but not exactly. There's a bureaucracy called the European Commission, whose job is to develop new laws and then to implement those laws once they're passed. And that's based in Brussels. There's a European Parliament, which is a directly elected legislature that oversees, or discusses the proposals for laws that come from the European Commission. The European Parliament is split between 3 different cities: Strasbourg in France, Brussels and Luxembourg. I keep telling my students that because I'm British, I'm allowed to be rude about the French. And most Americans are quite happy with this. So if I could just briefly be rude about the French. They insist on keeping the European Parliament building in Strasbourg, even though the Parliament actually meets there for about 4 or 5 days every month. And so this building is empty for the rest of the year. And it adds something like $150 million to the European Parliament budget to move people back and forth from Strasbourg to Brussels. At some point, the European Parliament will probably move to Brussels, and then everybody can get on with their work. There's a thing called the Council of Ministers, which consists of all of the national government ministers, and they come together periodically to make the decisions on which proposals for new laws will become law. And then there's the European Court of Justice, which is based in Luxembourg, and is in many ways a conventional constitutional court. So its job is to make sure that the different treaties that the Europeans have signed among themselves are actually carried out and respected in principle and in the letter. In terms of the achievements of the European Union, there's a lot of debate in Europe about whether it's been a good thing or not. There's a lot of people called Eurosceptics, or they like to call themselves Euro-realists. And these Eurosceptics believe that the EU has gone too far and that it's lost sight of its original goals, which were the creation of this European market that would bring prosperity to as many Europeans as possible. And that what's happened is the Europeans have moved into areas that they were never supposed to move into. And when they start talking about a common foreign policy and a common defense policy, this is all wrong. So in terms of the achievements and the problems, it really depends on who you talk to. So I'm a Euro optimist. I'm very unusual. I'm British, and I think the EU is a good idea. The vast majority of people in Britain do not think the EU is a good idea. And even a couple of weeks ago, the Liberal Democratic Party in Britain was talking about having another referendum on British membership of the EU, which I thought was settled back in 1973, but apparently not. I think it's been very good for Europe. It's helped bring peace and stability to Europe. It's made Europe richer. It's made Europe more active on the international stage. It's provided all kinds of benefits for Europeans. Yes, there's been a little bit of a loss of national identity, but nationalism was always one of Europe's major problems. So perhaps it's good that the Europeans stopped thinking of themselves so nationalistically. One of the interesting effects of integration at the large level has been the increase in local national identity within countries. So along with European integration, you've seen the Scottish independence movement build up steam, not as a result of European integration, but as part of the changes in the balance of power in Europe. The Catalans, the Basques, the Corsicans, all of these national identities, these national groups have become more assertive as a result of what's been happening there. But the nation state is still in place in the EU. The EU is now the biggest marketplace in the world. The combined gross national product of the EU is about $13 trillion. The United States is around about $12 trillion. It has a very large population. About 490 million people now live in the EU compared to 300 million in this country. It's the biggest trading power in the world. It's the biggest source of foreign direct investment in the world. Much of that comes to the United States. Something like 6 million people in this country work for European companies or for wholly owned subsidiaries of European companies. And at the end of the day, whatever you think about the EU, they've had peace in Europe for the longest spell in its entire recorded history. There has never been such a long spell of time in Europe where someone hasn't been fighting someone else or there hasn't been a general war in Europe. And okay, you can say that the United States has played a major role in that, which is true. The United States invested in Europe. The Marshall Plan helped reconstruct Europe after the war. NATO gave Europe the security blanket it needed. The United States has been a major player in Europe. But the Europeans themselves have been able to put behind them all of these historical problems that they've had and have been peaceful. And the European Union has been a major part of that. In terms of the problems, well, there's the embarrassment of the common foreign security policy, which really hasn't happened yet. There is no common security policy. There have been moves to try and develop one. There is no European military. But there isn't a desire either to develop a European military. The Europeans would rather not fight. They would rather negotiate or offer economic incentives or those kinds of things. They prefer, in other words, to use what's called soft power instead of hard power. If you add up the European armies and navies and air forces, it's really quite substantial. The Europeans have more military hardware than most people think they do. But the problem is they have 27 separate sets of hardware. There is no common security policy. And to a large extent, the Europeans have really lived off the United States for a long time. Whether this has been because they felt it was just the opportunistic thing to do, or whether Europeans did not want to develop a military capacity is a debatable point. A book was published a few years ago called Of Paradise and Power by Robert Kagan, a neoconservative commentator in this country. It became a best-selling book, in which he said that when the United States was weak in the 19th century, it was not a military power. But the Europeans, who had a lot of military in the 19th century, were aggressive and used hard power. Now the roles have changed. The United States is the dominant power, and it uses its military deliberately, whereas the Europeans are taking a free ride, essentially, at the expense of the United States. But the counter-argument to that is that the Europeans have done this deliberately because they don't believe in the use of hard power. They would rather negotiate, they would rather be involved in peacekeeping and humanitarian activities and things like this. Their critics say this is just appeasement and living off the United States and so on. So there's a debate about whether that's been an achievement or not. The European Union is accused of not being sufficiently democratic. Somebody once joked that if the EU applied to join the EU, it would be turned down on the basis that it's not sufficiently democratic. To join the EU, you have to meet what are called the Copenhagen Criteria. There's 3 qualities that you have to have. One is that you have to be democratic, one is you have to be a free market system, and one is you must be prepared to adopt the entire body of existing European law. Now, there's nothing in there that says you have to be European. It's just assumed that no countries are going to get into the EU unless they are European. But the European Union itself is not a particularly democratic institution. It's not accountable. It's not always very transparent. But then it's not a federal United States of Europe. It's more of a confederal Europe in which this kind of lack of accountability is actually excusable. People are represented at the national level. Their national governments then represent them at the European level. So there's indirect representation. So the argument that the EU is not democratic is a very contentious argument. Okay, in about the next last few minutes that I have left, let me talk about this concept of the European superpower. There's a lot of discussion in this country that the United States is the world's last remaining superpower. You hear there's a lot of publications about the lone superpower, the only superpower, the last superpower, the hyperpower. The United States has become now so fabulously wealthy and powerful that it even surpasses being a mere superpower. And nobody else comes close to the United States. Well, there's a counter-argument to that it all depends on how you define power. What do you think is important in terms of power? The definition of a superpower, and there have only been 2 so far that everybody agreed on. That was obviously the United States and the Soviet Union. But the definition of a superpower is an entity, and I say entity because it doesn't have to be a country. In practice so far, both of them have been, that has global interests and has the ability to engage itself at a global level. And only 2 countries have clearly been able to do that. If you think of power in military terms, as many people insist on doing, and arguing that it doesn't really matter what else you have, if you don't have the weapons, everything else is kind of beside the point, then yes, the United States is a superpower and nobody else comes close. The Chinese maybe one day, the Russians perhaps at some point, maybe India, maybe Brazil, but all at some point in the future. Everybody kind of forgets about Europe. There's been a lot of publication on China as being the next superpower. There was a Newsweek cover story about 6 weeks ago on China, the next superpower. I would argue that, okay, China may be a superpower at some point in the future, but Europe already is. But it's not a military superpower. It has global interests. It is engaged globally, but it doesn't do it in a military sense. It does it in an economic sense and in a political sense. And what I mean by a political sense is that the European Union has become a new kind of political model that promotes different values from those promoted by the United States. The 2 sides agree on democracy and capitalism, but that's about it, actually. Once you start looking at the detail of what the Europeans and the Americans have projected in terms of foreign policy, the Europeans are increasingly at odds with the United States. Now, they always were, but during the Cold War, the Europeans never felt confident enough to publicly criticize the United States. But there are multiple examples throughout the Cold War where the Europeans were very nervous and actually quite critical of US policy. The Suez Crisis in 1956, the Cuban Missile Crisis, Vietnam, where no European country supported the Vietnam War, and Lyndon Johnson tried his best to get the British government to send a token platoon of pipers to walk down the streets of Saigon just to make a political statement. And Harold Wilson, the Prime Minister, refused to even do that. And there was a lot of political opposition in Europe to the Vietnam War. Differences of opinion over the Middle East, over the Arab-Israeli problem. And then a whole list of these differences, but they were all kept quiet because the Europeans couldn't afford to upset the Americans. I mean, it's more complicated than that, but that's the basic idea. Since the end of the Cold War, Europeans have felt, well, we can make our disagreements more public. And so they've become a little bit more assertive. And March 2003 is really a landmark event when the Germans and the French went public with their criticism of US policy, which had never been done before quite so aggressively. So what you see now is a European superpower which promotes economic interests. It promotes political developments that are different from those of the United States. They don't rely on military options. They prefer to negotiate and provide incentives. And in that sense, they have become, we've now become part of, I think, a two-superpower world again, with the United States and the Europeans. But the relationship between the two is completely different from the relationship between the Soviets and the United States. But as I say, I've had difficulty convincing people of this, but I still think I'm right. And hopefully, in the not-too-distant future, maybe some other people will come around, and it won't be too late for me to enjoy my 15 minutes of fame. We'll see. And on that point, I think I will stop and invite questions.
Microphone at either end of the stage here for anyone interested in asking a question of Dr. McCormick. I invite you to just come down, ask your questions.
Yep.
Go ahead. Dr. McCormick, thank you. Did you say that in Britain the Liberal Democratic Party called for another referendum on EU membership?
Yeah, the leader talked about perhaps having the need for a referendum. I haven't heard very much about it since he came up with this idea, but it was a bit of a surprise when he did, yeah.
Was the Liberal Democratic Party similar to the Labour Party?
No, the Liberal Democrats are the third party in Britain. They're sort of a moderate left-wing centre party.
I guess the question I have was that I recall in reading Margaret Thatcher's autobiography in the Downing Street years that she had criticism for the European Union also and called it the Babel Express, as in the Tower of Babel.
Right.
I also recall that when the European Union Constitution was put to the Dutch and French voters, that they both turned it down. What were the concerns that the Dutch and French had and Mrs. Thatcher had at the time, and have those concerns been addressed?
The French and Dutch votes were, to a large extent, driven by voter criticism of national government policy in France and the Netherlands. The government of Jacques Chirac in France was extremely unpopular at the time that referendum was held. And what has tended to happen in many cases when they have these national referenda, they're often more of a vote on what the public feels about the national government rather than what they feel about the actual topic of the question. So to some extent, the negative vote in the Netherlands and France were really not about the Constitution. Having said that, though, the Constitution was very controversial because people felt that it was pushing the European Union too far in the direction of becoming like a federal United States of Europe, and for a lot of people that is a very uncomfortable idea. Margaret Thatcher's concerns, which was ironic because her predecessor, Edward Heath, was the Prime Minister that negotiated British membership of the European Economic Community. Of course, Thatcher and Edward Heath hated each other, so maybe that was part of it as well. But Thatcher, she was a conservative, and she felt that the European Union was becoming too regulatory, and that she had spent her prime ministership, she once said in a famous statement, "I've not spent the last few years pushing back the frontiers of the state only to have them reimposed by Brussels." So she was concerned about the fact that the European regulations were becoming this additional burden on the market in Britain. And she felt that the EU had kind of lost its sense of direction, which a lot of people feel the same way. But you know, Mrs. Thatcher had some very strong opinions, and they weren't always correct. But it's a matter of opinion as to whether the EU has been as much of a regulatory imposition as she suggested it has been.
touch on it too much, but with the EU's current expansion, they've currently brought Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and a few other nations into the European Union. Those three countries primarily, and also Ukraine and Belarus, which have also come up into questions as of late about EU membership, they're primarily Russian-influenced regions, old Soviet bloc. EU former Soviet relations, Russian relations in these days, have there been a lot of static between the two after the oil embargo with the Ukraine and with expansion of NATO and the EU into the far Eastern Europe that the Russians have always primarily considered their backyard? How's that straining the relationship between those two powers?
Yes, there have been strains. The Russians have been concerned about the fact that three former Soviet republics are now members not just of the EU but also of NATO. There's a concern about how far the expansion of the EU is going to move. The only country at the moment where there's any questions really about potential membership is Belarus, because Belarus is an authoritarian system. But in the Ukrainian elections recently, the EU has been a major factor. What is the different parties' position on potential membership? Even in Serbia, it's been a factor there, which party wants EU membership and which doesn't. In terms of Russia, I don't think the Europeans face any kind of different concerns than the United States, other than the fact that they're right next door to Russia and that they rely on Russia for most of their natural gas supplies. So there's a strategic problem at work there. But European-Russian relations were coming along as well as anybody could be expected until Vladimir Putin started to change direction. So in terms of the future, I think the Europeans will have the same concerns as the United States, but I don't think that there will be any particular problems that are unique to that particular geographical location.
I just returned from eastern Slovakia a week ago. I spent about 10 days there at the invitation of some family on my mother's side. It was real interesting. I've been there about 4 times prior to that, as early as 1974. Interesting observations, and had a great interpreter who spoke better English and better American English than some Americans. He was informing me that a number of things that are going on in western Slovakia, one of the smallest of the new states, that investments in Bratislava are such that the cost of living in Bratislava in many places now exceeds the cost of living in Vienna, which is right across the river, basically. My question really is, Eastern Europe, or Eastern Slovakia seems to be taking the European Union's support and lead a little slower than the rest of Slovakia. What do you think is the likelihood of the onset of the euro, which I understand in Slovakia is going to happen yet this year, where it hasn't happened yet in the Czech Republic? What do you think is the likelihood, or could happen with the onset of the euro in Slovakia if it happens this year in terms of their formerly fast economic growth?
I don't know enough about Slovakia or about economics to really be able to put together an intelligent answer to that. Expansion and membership of the euro is inevitable and predicted and planned for. I think the euro is going to be an accelerated economic lesson for East European countries, part of the transition. I don't sense that there's going to be any particular problems, but again, I don't know enough about the Slovak situation to be able to really comment on the situation there. I think that the benefits of being in the euro are surely going to outweigh the costs, in the sense of the fact that Slovakia has access now to this market, which it does anyway, but with the euro there, it's going to be easier. It is going to lead to inflation and price increases as it has in the rest of Europe. Why that's happened, I'm not entirely clear. But generally, I'm probably not qualified to answer the question, sorry.
My question has to do with EU membership, specifically Malta. Why is Malta in the EU and not Andorra, Monaco, Liechtenstein, And if Turkey does get into the EU, is my second question, doesn't Russia have to be allowed in?
Malta is an independent sovereign state, whereas Monaco and Andorra and Liechtenstein and the Isle of Man are all part of a bigger surrounding nation state. Now, don't ask me about the specifics of the legal relationship. The Channel Islands in Britain, which are part of Britain, are not part of the European Union because, for some strange reason, they belong to the Queen. I'm not quite sure what the legality of that is. So there's these strange anomalies within the EU. To all intents and purposes, Monaco, for example, is in. I mean, there's no border between Monaco and France. I don't know, I believe that Monaco is subject to European law just like the rest of France is. So, but Malta is an independent sovereign state like Luxembourg or Cyprus or whatever. The fact that it's just so small is probably the most notable thing about it. But Luxembourg is just as small. I think their population is about 300,000, 400,000. And Luxembourg was a founder member and has done very well. In terms of future, I wish this screensaver would stop coming on. Yeah, where does Europe end? The Ural Mountains, which are approximately up here, were chosen just for convenience by a 19th century Russian cartographer who wanted to claim that Russia was a European country. So does that mean Russia's a European country? Not very convincingly, since 75% of it is east of the Urals. People have talked about Russia as a potential member, but I don't think very seriously. Silvio Berlusconi, I don't know how seriously you can take him, but he talked about Israel as a possible future member of the EU. Israel was set up out of the Holocaust experience, has a strong relationship with Europe over the centuries. Many Israelis are European by origin, so why shouldn't Israel come in? I don't think anyone's taking that one very seriously either. Cyprus is in, and it's further away from Brussels than Turkey or Ankara, so why shouldn't Turkey come in? If Turkey comes in, why not allow, I don't know, Armenia and Georgia and Azerbaijan? Where does it end? It has to end somewhere. Otherwise, well, just take back the United States, I guess. But there is a problem now. It's called enlargement fatigue. There's been a reaction among the existing member states about any future expansion, simply because ingesting these 12 new countries that have just joined since 2004 is a really substantial challenge. But my prediction is that expansion will stop at the Russian border, so that Ukraine, Moldova, and potentially Belarus will become members at some point in the future. But we're talking quite a long way down the line. And even Switzerland, which has had a referendum in which they turned down membership of the EU, I think the economic pressures on Switzerland will grow as well. But I don't think they'll go any further east than Russia, so you're safe.
Okay, so my question was, I was really surprised to hear you say that the tension between the United States and Europe is just inevitable at the end of the Cold War. Because from my perspective, at least, I think a lot of it has to do with the real strong unilateralism of the United States in the past 8 years.
Right.
I mean, do you really think that it's just the end of the Cold War, or do you think that, a different administration could have had it differently?
Yeah, well, that's the big question. Is this about George Bush or is it about the United States? I think almost inevitably things have to improve after the end of this year. They can't get any worse, surely. But I think what the end of the Cold War has shown, and George Bush actually has a lot of credit to take. I think the Europeans owe him a lot in the sense of sort of waking them up to some new realities that they hadn't thought of, is that there are so many now social and cultural differences between the United States and Europe, and so many differences in terms of the way they manage foreign relations and relations to other countries, that I think the tensions will always be there. Not to the point where we're going to have a serious breakdown. I mean, the United States and the EU is just so heavily invested in each other. We need each other. And people will often say, well, we work much better together than in confrontation with each other, which is perfectly true. But I think the Europeans are becoming more assertive and more willing to say, okay, we agree with you on this, but we don't agree with you on the other thing. And for that reason, I think that the relationship will just never be the same again. I think March 2003 has brought about a fairly significant change, which I think is permanent. But I think the change was already there before, people just didn't notice it.
What do you think about the argument that Turkey needs to take responsibility for the Armenian genocide before they're seriously considered? Or do you think that's more of a symbolic feet dragging, if you will, or do you think there's substance to that argument?
Gosh, again, sorry, I don't really know enough about Turkey. I know enough Turks to know that if you talk about Kurdistan, they get very, very upset. And that whole sort of area, that history of Turkey, Armenia, Kurdistan, all of those kinds of issues are complicated. And I don't know enough about it to be able to really answer. But Turkey is already making adjustments. It has already made adjustments to join. It's abolished capital punishment. It's changed many of its laws already. Turkish government officials are working with European government officials just to learn how things are done. And I think ultimately, just by sort of the sheer effort that the Turks have made, that Turkey will become a member. Also the strategic interest. I mean, I think it's in European interest to allow Turkey into the EU as a bridge to the Middle East and to the Islamic world. And I think questions like the Armenian genocide and what to do about the Kurds may get sacrificed on the altar of that arrangement at some point. But I don't think they're going to stop it. I think the Turks could probably point the finger at other European countries and say, okay, we have our Armenians, you have this, that, and the next thing, so those of you who are without sin cast the first stone.
Wanted to give a follow-up question. My first one, you did mention that the voting of the Dutch and the French against the EU Constitution was largely a reflection of what they thought of their own local governments rather than what they necessarily thought of the EU Constitution. If I had to vote on that Constitution, I would vote against it myself. I went online and looked over a copy of it at eurounion.org, and I read things like under human rights, personal privacy, property ownership, under electronic privacy, it said, for example, that there would be no arbitrary electronic surveillance. I compare that with my constitutional rights under the First Amendment, and they have to produce a probable cause. I would get a trial by jury. I have the right of habeas corpus. None of those things appear in the European Union Constitution, at least yet. Are those proposed changes, or is that not the thinking?
I didn't mean to. I probably get the wrong impression that it was all about domestic politics, which it isn't. I mean, there's been a lot of resistance to many aspects of the Constitution by itself, irrespective of what people felt about national governments. Something like the Constitution was needed, and actually they're going to get it through by stealth, and they're just going to call it the Treaty of Lisbon. And they're going to make a few changes, and then this Treaty of Lisbon will come into effect, and most of the changes that were incorporated in the Constitution will come about anyway. The basic problem with the Constitution was that it was just too detailed. They tried to nickel and dime everything. They wanted to cover every single eventuality, whereas they should have copied the US Constitution in the sense of being more declaratory and more ambiguous and allowing for interpretation by the Court of Justice. But they didn't do that, and in a sense they set themselves up for failure to begin with. There's been a lot of questions among Eurosceptics about the increasing power of European institutions and the effect that this has had on national sovereignty. This is true, and by no means is the EU a perfect entity, but I think the glass is half full rather than half empty. I'd say it's actually more than half full. And the adjustments have had to have been made that were worth it, even though it meant some sacrifices along the way. The kind of things that you're talking about are fairly serious sacrifices. But I'm confident at the end of the day that the judicial system will address those and stop them from becoming problems. The other thing is the Europeans are not quite so interested or so focused on individual rights as Americans are. And Americans are very much interested in that sort of aspect of legal developments. Whereas the Europeans are more, I don't know what the right word to use is, more community-minded, I suppose, rather than being individually minded. That's a huge generalization.
Dr. McCormick, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Before we rush out of here tonight, a couple of quick announcements. For those of you who recognize our videographer here, Klaus Quandt, who's sitting quietly behind the camera, he was featured in yesterday's Grand Rapids Press Sunday Profile. Klaus is with us every week and videotapes these for future viewing on the Educational Programming Channel. He's with us from Grand Rapids Community College, and I wanted to extend your 15 minutes of fame for another 30 seconds, Klaus. And then I'd be remiss if I didn't recognize our Executive Director, Dixie Anderson, who's quickly running out the door here. Dixie was recently voted one of West Michigan's 50 most influential women. So, Dixie, I stated that wrongly in the past. I thought Dixie was one of the most influential women over 50 in West Michigan. But either way, it's the same thing. So, next week, Syrian ambassador to the United States, Ambassador Mustafa. We'll see you next week. Thanks.